Hey guys, we are back with yet another Hell's Kitchen season chef ranking, this time doing one for season 8. And obviously season 8's a very tough season to do a ranking for, namely because there's a lot of really bad chefs on the season, and there's a lot of people that I just didn't know what to do with, but I'm going to do my best to break it down. But we have 16 chefs to rank here, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 16, the chef I believe did the worst on the season is Antonia, the first boot of the season. And obviously there's very little to say about Antonia's game, where she was literally pulled from the game before the first service due to her not feeling well and her falling sick. And obviously there isn't too much to break down with her game outside of her signature dish, which ends up being an all-time bad one, where she ended up trying to put together this gumbo, even though it normally takes hours to make, and it ended up being so bad that Ramsay handed it off to everyone in the cast for them to taste, just so that they can see how bad it is. And for her dish to be so bad that Ramsay had that response, and for that to literally be her entire game, instantly knocks her to the bottom of the list for me. I feel like there's very little positive I can say about her run outside of that one thing, which is why it's here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have someone you were probably expecting to be at the bottom, but I have them one spot higher, and here we have Raj. And obviously Raj is a very notable character on the show. He was actually one of the characters I knew about even before I got into Hell's Kitchen. And obviously Raj has a pretty notorious run here where he makes a bevy of mistakes across all three of his services, where in service 1 he doesn't know how to make pizza dough. In service 2 you have him on the garnish station and Vinnie telling customers to not order sides because he has no faith in Raj to get the sides out. And then he later gets kicked out of the kitchen due to him not cooking the sides to order, which is all pretty bad. In service 3 you have him claiming to have cooked thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of salmon, only to completely suck on the fish station and run out of the sole special. But even beyond that, you have his team completely hating him and constantly getting into arguments with him and just having no faith in him as a chef, to where we literally see him being put up in the first 2 services that he's eligible for. And then we eventually get to his boot round where he is eliminated despite being on the winning team. So obviously all those things are really bad, and a big reason why he is this low on the list, despite him technically surviving some nominations. But the one thing I will give him over Antonia is he at least had a good signature dish with the seafood and vegetable pancake. And yes, while it was a mess on paper, it actually ended up tasting pretty good, which is obviously way more than I can say for Antonia. So again, that's at least something. But beyond that, everything else about his run here is pretty terrible. I feel like Raj is someone that just wasn't really cut out for a Hell's Kitchen environment, despite him not technically being the worst chef in the world on paper. I feel like with his run here being so actively bad, I do have him here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we are going to the first proper boot of the season, and here we have Lisa. And Lisa feels like a pretty standard first boot where she has a bad signature dish and then follows it up with a pretty mediocre service where she's just kind of slow for a lot of it, not really getting a lot of orders out. She also messes up a dish by cooking it raw. And again, it's just kind of put up and taken out for not having much potential there. Though at the same time, I feel like Raj probably would have been taken out over her if you were basing it purely off their performance. And I feel like Lisa was more so taken out first because she was less of a character compared to Raj. So I feel like that was a factor for me to consider. Then also, she wasn't as hated by her team compared to Raj, who was very clearly a pariah from day one. So I feel like that was enough to have her at least above Raj for me, but really not much higher. So she's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and this is where the list starts to get weird, as like I mentioned earlier, the cast of the season is just noticeably weaker than the other ones I've covered up to this point. And I feel like the boot order doesn't quite reflect that to a degree. So with that, we're actually jumping forward a good amount in the boot order here. By number 13, we do have Boris. And I think Boris is kind of looked at as a pretty terrible chef on the season, despite him making it all the way to 9th place. Now I will say that he has an okay start where he has a good signature dish, and even beyond that, he actually has a decent start to his first service, but he kind of goes downhill as the service goes along, where he ends up doing a Ramsay impression in front of Ramsay, which obviously gets on his nerves. And then obviously he has a hard time making the pizza with Raj. That's obviously kind of humorous. Service 2 is pretty rough, where he ends up getting kicked out of the kitchen along with the rest of his team, and he ends up getting nominated there, but he's able to scrape through that. His team does win service 3, but even then he makes some mistakes on the meat station there. Service 4, he's washing dishes in the middle of service, and Ramsay ends up putting him on dishwasher duties, which is pretty funny. He's nominated yet again, and we get to the pitch where he claims to be the strongest chef, and while he does great through that, we later see in the following episode him trying to be a leader during the challenge, only for no one to listen to him. And he follows it up with another mediocre service on the fish station, where he ends up having a whole bunch of mistakes with the crab cakes, and while his team does win the service, we also have Ramsay calling him out during the post-mortem, which isn't great. Service 6 is also really bad, where he makes a whole bunch of mistakes on the garnish station, and he's kicked out of the kitchen yet again, and he's largely saved here by Melissa making an even bigger mistake by wasting 7 pounds of scallops. We get to episode 7, where his team calls him the weakest link, and then he follows it up with another mediocre service where he's on the meat station, and he ends up making a whole bunch of mistakes there, kind of gets on Gordon's nerves, and he ends up being nominated for the 4th time in 7 episodes. And while he is taken off, it was also a non-elimination, so I don't know how much credit to give him there. And then we get to his boot round, which is also pretty bad, where he's on the appetizers, and his team feels the need to jump into a station to help him out, due to him being seen as the weakest chef, and even outside of that he makes some mistakes, he's kicked out of the kitchen, and he's eventually put up and eliminated here. So on the whole, it is an extremely mediocre run on his end, where while he does get all the way to 9th place and all the way to service 8, I feel like his run there is mostly mediocre, and I feel like there are people eliminated earlier than him that didn't make as many mistakes compared to him. So I feel like for those reasons, I do have Boris here, number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have a chef kind of similar to Boris, except I feel like this person had a slightly better start to their game, and here we have Melissa. And I feel like Melissa's kind of on the same level as Boris, and she is eliminated a round earlier than Boris. However, I feel like she was in a better position within her team for a lot of the season compared to Boris. Now right off the bat, she has a bad signature dish, and even beyond that, her service 1 is pretty mediocre, but they win that, so whatever. Service 2 is also kind of mediocre, where she's on the garnish station, makes some mistakes there, she puts out a wrong order, and she's even moved to maitre d', though again, they win that service, so whatever. We get the service 3, which is also pretty bad. She ends up making Gandhi's flip-flop, which is pretty funny. And she was considered for nomination, particularly by Julian. However, she does actually avoid the block here, so that is something I will give her. You also have service 4, which I actually think is not that bad for Melissa, where while she does make some mistakes earlier on the appetizers with the raviolis, she does actually recover to a degree, where she does help Sabrina on the grill station, and she does actually put out some good dishes. Now, yes, she is nominated by Sabrina after the service, but even then, she is the first to be sent back in line by Ramsay, so I don't really fault her too much for that nomination, considering she wasn't in that much danger of going home. But then we get to service 5, where she ends up making an all-time bad decision here of wasting her entire team's supply of fillets by cooking them while they were still working on appetizers. And she also overcooks them at that, so she literally wasted over $1,000 worth of produce there, and she very easily could have been taken out there simply due to that one mistake, but instead she ends up getting swapped over to the blue team, being given one more chance by Ramsay. But then we get to the next service where she does the exact same thing of wasting over 7 pounds of scallops and single-handedly crippling her team in that service, and obviously she is taken out at that point. So in a lot of ways, I actually consider Melissa's run here to be pretty similar to that of Boris's. Now obviously Boris doesn't have a mistake to the magnitude that Melissa does in her last 2 services. However, the main reason I have her above Boris is that I feel like her run before that point was a bit more consistent than Boris's, where yeah, she wasn't great, but she at least had one solid service, that being service 4, which is probably better than anything Boris did during his season. And I feel like with her being slightly more respected by the red team compared to Boris on the red team, I feel like those things were just enough to give her the edge for me, so I have her here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we are finally going back to the earliest boot left on the board, and here we have Curtis. And again, the fact that Curtis is this high on the list, despite him being the 3rd boot of the season, really speaks to how wonky the boot order here is relative to the actual players' games. Now, I will actually say that Curtis's game here isn't that impressive, where he has a bad signature dish, and even beyond that, he has a terrible service too, where he's on the sushi station. He gets kicked out of the service after doing poorly on the station, and he's eventually eliminated despite not being nominated. And I feel like normally I would have him lower on the list due to those knocks. However, I think there are two major things that are kind of saving him here on this ranking. One is that he was working on a station that normally isn't offered on Hell's Kitchen, that being the sushi station, and I feel like had Curtis stayed in the game and gotten back to another service with a more standard menu, Curtis could have potentially rebounded here. But I think the other bigger thing to point out is there were two very blatant targets at this round, with one that being Raj, who obviously was a pariah by that point and was clearly not cut out for Hell's Kitchen, and you have Vinnie, who had gone behind Ramsey's back to tell customers to not order sides while he was a waiter. And I feel like Ramsey could have easily taken out one of those two, and Curtis just kind of got unlucky that he had the least to bring to the table, both as a character but also as a chef. So to that end, I actually think Curtis gets kind of unlucky here in the round that it gets taken out. Now again, I'm not saying Curtis is a great chef at the end of the day, but I feel like compared to the other people we already talked about, I feel like he got a bit more unlucky in his boot round than those other people, which is why he's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we're going back to another relatively early boot, though not exactly following the boot order, and here we have Emily. And Emily is a bit of a weird case as well, as she does make it all the way to Service 5, and there are some high points with her game, like she does have a good signature dish in episode 1, and she also has two decent services. Now mind you, one of them is as a waiter, but she does technically have some good services in her, but I feel like for the most part, her run here is kind of mediocre, where she's pretty rocky in service 2 on the meat station. She even admits to Ramsey that she doesn't know how to cook meat, though at the same time, she does make a good dish there, so at least there's that. Service 3 is kind of wonky as well, where she has a customer sending back a dish for being too salty. She obviously gets nominated after this service, and she probably goes home had Ramsey not decided to cut Raj at that point, despite being on the winning team, though she's able to rebound with her service 4, which is decent, but then service 5 is obviously pretty bad, where she's on the fish station, makes a bunch of mistakes with crab cakes, and she's eventually put up and taken out for being the weakest link on her team. I feel like for the most part, her run here is not that great at the end of the day, and I feel like that's a big reason why I don't have her higher in the list. Though at the same time, I feel like compared to people like Boris and Melissa, I don't think she makes as many massive mistakes compared to those two, and she did have a couple of good services in her, which is why she's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have someone kind of similar to Emily, but I feel like they're one step above them, and here we have Lewis. And Lewis is also kind of mediocre. He doesn't really have too much going for him. Again, bad signature dish, and he does have a couple of bad services. But similar to Emily, I do think he has a couple of good services in him. His service 1 isn't that bad on the Garner station, and his service 3 is also fine enough. And he also is not considered the weakest link on his team, unlike Emily was, which I feel like is one reason why I do have him above Emily, even though he was taken out one round before her. But again, his final service is pretty bad, where he's on the grill and he messes up a bunch of pork and salmon. He gets kicked out of the kitchen, and all of it's pretty bad. He obviously has a pretty clear downfall there. But I feel like his run up to that point was a bit more consistent compared to Emily, which is why I have him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and I did deliberate with these next two as well. I feel like these two are relatively close in my eyes. Though at number 8, we do have someone who did bring it more upon themselves, and here we have Vinnie. And Vinnie, for the most part, is a relatively decent chef on the season. I feel like if Vinnie were to come back for another season, I feel like he definitely would have more potential in him, though obviously his run here is kind of rocky. Now right off the bat, he does have an okay signature dish, and he does alright in the first service, but then we get to service 2, which is disastrous for Vinnie, where he's obviously assigned to assistant maitre d', and he has his whole plan of telling the customers to not order sides with their dishes because Raj is working the Garner station. And while I understand the worry of him thinking that the blue team's going to lose a service if Raj holds up the kitchen with the garnishes, I do think this is a pretty misguided plan, as I feel like if Vinnie really had that little faith in Raj to do his job, he would have been better off letting Raj crash and burn, getting Raj eliminated sooner, and thus the blue team can move on as normal. But instead he tries to make it work, and I feel like after he gets caught for this, it really scars Vinnie's relationship with Ramsey moving forward, where while Vinnie does survive this round, I also feel like this incident makes it very hard, if not impossible, for Vinnie to actually win the game moving forward, as it really shatters the trust that Ramsey Ramsey had with Vinnie coming into it. Now, in terms of his actual services, I do feel like Vinnie recovers a bit after this, where his next couple services are pretty decent, doing well in services 3, 4, 5, and 6. But then in service 7, he makes another pretty big mistake where he ends up putting up old risotto for the table going out to Ramsey's family, which only sours that relationship further. But then his last couple services are pretty bad, where service 8 is pretty bad, where customers are sending back dishes, he gets kicked out of the kitchen, and he's nominated for the second time of the season. Service 9 is also pretty bad, where he is once again kicked out of the kitchen. And then his boot round is pretty bad as well, where he's on the meat station and he messes up some dishes there, gets moved to the fish station and screws up more dishes there, which is all pretty bad. And he is eventually taken out for his declining performance in these last couple of services. So on the whole, I don't feel like Vinny's the worst chef in the world, and he definitely has a good stretch in the middle, but the reason I don't have him higher in the list is his bad relationship with Ramsey, where he does things that actively make that relationship worse, and I feel like those things would have made it very difficult for him to win the game moving forward, where we literally saw Ramsey being harder on him due to his previous deception, and I feel like even if his performance didn't drop off, I still find it very hard to see how Ramsey allows Vinny to win the game by the end of it, considering that he sees Vinny as deceptive and dishonest. So I feel like those things make it hard for me to see Vinny doing well in the game, which is why he's here number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have the other chef I was talking about, and here we have Rob. Now, there is a debate for Rob being below Vinny, as if you are looking at his services, I feel like Vinny was probably a little more consistent in actual services, and while Rob wasn't terrible, he definitely had more bad services to point out, where he does have a bad signature dish to start, and his first 2 services are okay, even though he does get kicked out of service 2. And then in service 3, he does make a minor mistake of not putting pineapple in a fruit bowl, but really nothing too major outside of that. Service 4 is a bit rough, where he's on the pizza station and a customer does send back the dish and Ramsey has him eat it, which is pretty funny. But beyond that, a lot of his first half is kind of fine. And while his service 7 is pretty bad, where he is nominated after being really slow for a lot of that service on the garnish station, I don't feel like he makes that many mistakes compared to a lot of the other players we already talked about. But then we get to service 8, which is pretty bad, where he's on the meat station and he does make a number of mistakes there that results in him getting kicked out. And he is eventually nominated here, but he's able to scrape on through. And then his boot round in service 9 is not much better, where he goes over 4 in the blind taste test and he makes a bunch of mistakes on the fish station. We see Ramsey pulling him aside to get a grip, only for him to continue making mistakes, and he gets kicked out of the service there. And while he gives a pretty bad pitch during his elimination, he was probably going home anyway, considering he had already been put up at the last 3 nominations in a row, which is pretty bad. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Rod's run is kind of similar to Vinny's, where he does have a slow but precipitous downfall that eventually results in him being taken out around before Vinny. But the reason I have him above Vinny is he at least had a better relationship with Vinny. He didn't actively sabotage his relationship with Ramsey, so where I could have seen a world where Rob could have recovered in the future, potentially gone on to win the game compared to Vinny, which is why I do have him one spot higher at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and from this point on, every chef left made it to the black jackets, and it's just a matter of ordering them. However, these next 2 were a bit debatable in my eyes. I wasn't entirely sure what to make of them. But number 6, I actually had the chef that made it a little bit further in the game, but we do have Gail. And for the most part, Gail played a fine game on this season, though it's not without its hiccups. Now, she does have a bad signature dish to start, which is not a great look, but for the first 2 services, she's able to hold her own, not making any major mistakes there. It's not until service 3 that we start to see her slipping up a bit, where we have a fire breaking out her station. You also have Ramsey accusing her of giving up, though she is able to recover a bit across that service. Those service 4s weren't actively bad, where we see her making tons of mistakes on the pasta station, and she very well could have been nominated there, where Sabrina was targeting her, and Nona came very close to putting her name out there at the actual nomination ceremony, though she's able to scrape through that. Though I think after service 4, she does recover a bit, where while she does do some questionable prep work during service 5, we do see her doing pretty well across those next couple services, not making any major mistakes, and we even see her making some solid dishes across those services. So I actually think this is a pretty good stretch for her game-wise, and it's not until service 10 that we once again see her having a pretty bad service, where she does pretty poorly on the fish station there, making tons of mistakes there. We see her getting kicked out of that service, and she's even nominated by Ramsay at this service and was the last one to get her black jacket, which is not a great look. And from the black jacket's on, she just plays pretty poorly, where at the first black jacket service, she does pretty poorly on the fish station, making tons of mistakes there, and is even targeted by Sabrina during this round, though is able to avoid the block there. And then at the final 5, she has another bad service on the Garner station to where she is eventually taken out due to being the weakest link. So it is a debatable game where I think she has a pretty good stretch from services 5 through 9, but I feel like the beginning of her game is fine, though not without its issues. And I think the tail end of her game, especially from the black jackets on, is pretty rough, to where I feel like I can't really have her too much higher than here, though it was a close debate between her and the next person. But I feel like with the next person having higher highs compared to Gail, I feel like that kind of leaves her behind here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we had the other person I was debating over between Gail and this person, but we do have Sabrina. And Sabrina's game on paper is definitely rockier than Gail's, where she ends up being nominated 7 times before her eventual boot, very much being the perpetual nominee that we come to see on a lot of these seasons during this era of the show. And obviously that's pretty bad. The fact that she's nominated 7 times over the course of the season is not a great look in my eyes. However, she also wins a best of the best and a best of the worst during the season. And she's even taken off the block by Ramsay in 2 of those instances where she was nominated. So I feel like that alone gives her higher highs than someone like a Gail, someone who also struggled a bit with consistency, but probably was not nominated as much as she probably should have. Now she kind of starts off on the wrong foot, where despite her having a good signature dish, she also annoys Ramsay during that segment by yawning, and she later gets nominated after her first service due to her making some mistakes there. You also have Ramsay calling her the most selfish chef on the cast, though she ends up getting another chance. And while she recovers a bit in service 2 by doing pretty well in the sushi station, she falls right back down in service 3, where she ends up annoying her team by not doing prep and even admitting to her team that she doesn't care about doing prep, which results in her being nominated again, though Ramsay ends up taking out Raj instead, despite him being on the winning team. Service 4 is also pretty rough, where we see her being pretty slow in getting orders out, and she also tries to target Melissa and Gail, only to be unsuccessful there, and she's nominated for the 3rd time, but she's once again able to scrape through that. Though she follows it up with a pretty solid service in service 5, where she ends up winning the best of the worst there, and while she fails to get out her target in Melissa, due to it being a non-elimination round, I still have to give her some credit for having that solid service to the point where she ended up winning a best of the worst. But she falls right back down, getting nominated the next 2 services in a row due to having pretty mediocre services both times and Ramsay being pretty annoyed by her. But I think she recovers a bit in service 8 and 9, having pretty good services there and even winning a best of the best in service 9. Though at the same time, she also goes over 4 in the blind taste test, which is not a particularly good look. Though I think after that, she's once again targeted due to her being seen as unfit, where she ends up being one of the last people to get her black jacket in service 10. And then obviously she's the first one out after the black jackets, where at that point she does have a pretty bad service there. And we have Ramsay accusing her of giving up. And she's just kind of taken out due to her being seen as the least fit to actually run a restaurant by the end of it. So it's sort of an up and down game where I very much consider putting her below Gail, considering she was eliminated a round before Gail, and obviously was nominated a bevy of times over the course of the season. But I think the main highlights for her are she has higher highs compared to Gail, where she does win a best of the best and a best of the worst, which I think are more impressive aspects to her game than anything that Gail has. So I think she's someone who definitely has glimmers of good gameplay here and there, and sort of similar to people like Autumn, I don't think she's necessarily the worst chef in the world, but I think she largely got on her team's nerves as well as Ramsay's nerves, and I think by the end of it, she was seen as pretty unfit to actually win the game, considering her personality and considering how much people seem to dislike her by the end of it. So at the end of the day, I can't really have her any higher than here, and there's definitely a debate for her being below Gail, but I think those highs are what leave her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and pretty similar to Sabrina, this is another chef that I think has a pretty turbulent run across the season, but we actually have the 4th place finisher, and here we have Trev. And Trev is such an interesting chef to assess across the season. He's definitely one of the better chefs in the grand scheme of things, though that's not really saying much considering the field here. but I do feel like he has a pretty rough start to the season, having a bad signature dish and following up with a pretty bad service on the starter station, messing up salad after salad, and he's eventually nominated for this service, though is able to survive that. Service 2 is also not great, where he was trying to help out Boris on his station, only for Trev to be kicked out of that service. Though I think after that he does steer the ship a bit, where he's able to keep his head down, not make any major mistakes for the next couple of services, until we get to service 6, where he gets swapped over to the red team due to him being seen as one of the bigger leaders from the men's side. And he's able to adapt well enough for those first 2 services on the red team, being a leader in service 6. And while he has a blow up in service 8, he's able to turn it around in service 9, winning best of the worst there, after the rest of his team got kicked out and he had to complete the service all by himself, which is pretty insane there. And while he's nominated in service 10 due to his team simply not liking him, he is the first to get his black jacket, which is a pretty notable sign there. Though I think we should also talk a bit about his flaws, where for one, he was definitely pretty cocky in the season, and he definitely rubbed a lot of his teammates the wrong way due to said cockiness. But also, after Service 10, he is nominated the next 3 times in a row, and he pretty much crumbles from the Black Jacket phase on, where in Service 11, we see him doing pretty poorly on the starter station there, making a bevy of mistakes, and also getting into arguments with Sabrina and Scott. Service 12 is also pretty bad, where Russell is targeting him, and you have him doing pretty poorly on the meat station, gets nominated again there. You have the first Final 4 round, where he also screws up on the meat station, to the point where Ramsey has to tell him to step out of the kitchen over and over again, which is also not a great look. And then you have the second Final 4 service, where by that point no one really respects his leadership, and you have Russell undercutting him during his turn on the pass by screwing up dishes, and by that point he was a pretty easy person to eliminate at that Final 4 service, which is not a great look. So I feel like Trev is a pretty up and down game as well, where very similar to the people we already talked about, he definitely had a strong middle stretch of the season, but I feel like the beginning of his game is not great, and obviously the Black Jacket phase of the game is also pretty rough, to where he just really went downhill by the end of the season. That, and also his cockiness really rubbing a lot of his teammates the wrong way, made it so that he was pretty unlikely to win by the end of it, considering his leadership style and people not really seeing him as a credible leader by the end of it. So it's pretty clear why he ends up being cut by the end of it, despite him having some potential as a chef. But I feel like the game that he plays on his season is pretty up and down, and I feel like the top 3 are pretty clear in my eyes, which is why he is here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and obviously it is the top 3 of the season, and it's just a matter of ordering them. And the order here was pretty interesting, not gonna lie, considering the outcome of the actual season. But number 3, we actually have the winner of the season, and here we have Nona. And Nona's a bit of a weird winner in Hell's Kitchen history. I know Flynn Masters has called her the worst winner in Hell's Kitchen history, and while I think she's a flawed winner, obviously, I probably would not have picked her if I were Ramsey. I don't think she's as bad as someone like a Christina, who I feel like I can pinpoint more things wrong with Christina's game. Whereas I feel like Nona's game, at least based off what we were shown on the show, is more so just mid, in my opinion. Though obviously some of that could just be due to her winner's edit. Now early on, she kind of has a pretty rough start, having a bad signature dish, followed by a not great service 1, where people like Sabrina want to target her. Even Julian's annoyed by her due to her lack of fine dining experience, though she avoids the block there. Though I think after that, she starts to perform more consistently, not really being a standout, but also not making any major mistakes across the services. You get the service 5, where Ramsey ends up agreeing with her after she says that Emily should be evicted. Sure enough, Emily's eliminated there. Though she does have a bit of a rough patch in services 6 and 7, being nominated in both of those services, and in service 6 being nominated by Ramsey himself, though she's able to avoid elimination there. You get to service 8, where while she does make a mistake by using old risotto, she ends up having a pretty good service outside of that on the starter station, though she ends up having a pretty rough service 9, where you have her struggling on the meat station with getting orders out. You have Ramsey jumping into her station, and she ends up getting kicked out of that service. And this is also the service where Ramsey pulls her aside after the nomination ceremony to tell her that she has a good palate, she just can't argue with him after making mistakes, which which I think really speaks to her winners edit. And she follows it up with an okay service 10 where she does make a mistake at one point, and she is the third to get her black jacket. Again, not particularly great, but also not terrible. Service 11, she's on table side, not too much to say there. Service 12, we do see her making a mistake at one point, though she also is able to have some good leadership where Ramsey ends up leaving the kitchen at one point, and she is able to have some leadership during his absence, which I think is a good look there. Though I think she gets a bit more shaky at both the Final Four services, where her first Final Four service is pretty mediocre. She makes some mistakes there, though also makes some good dishes there. And then we get to her second Final Four service, where she does okay on the pass leadership-wise, though she also fails the quality control test, which is not a great look, and she is the last person to earn her spot in the Final Two. And then we get to the Final Two, where she does okay enough to where she doesn't sabotage her chances of winning the game. And I feel like she largely wins due to Russell being seen as kind of a jerk and someone who is pretty unfit to run a restaurant. And I feel like that's a big reason why she ends up winning by the end of it. Where even though Russell was more dominant across the season and displayed more active leadership compared to Nona, I feel like it's his attitude that largely contributed to Ramsey giving Nona the win over Russell by the end of it. So on the whole, I feel like Nona's game is pretty fine for the most part. Definitely a bottom tier winner in my eyes, though I feel like compared to Christina from season 4, I feel like she isn't as actively bad compared to Christina, where I feel like there are fewer points in the season where we saw her truly being on the bottom and truly being in danger of going home. Now, yes, that service 6 and service 7 is pretty bad, and outside of that, she has plenty of mediocre services along the way, though I feel like comparing her to other chefs across the season, you can definitely see why Ramsey would advance her throughout the game, considering that she does display moments of good leadership and she doesn't make as many actively bad mistakes across many services compared to other chefs. And outside of service 6 and 7, she doesn't have a significant downturn period outside that either. It's just pretty consistent across the season. And while that's not particularly great, as I feel like she never really has a true highlight across the season, I feel like it's the lack of a low point that really allowed her to get through a lot of the game unscathed. And it's really just her winning at the end due to her being seen as more affable in the eyes of Ramsey. That obviously explains her win by the end of it. So it's sort of an interesting case where I feel like on one hand, Nona is a pretty underwhelming winner of the show, someone who realistically could only win on a season like season 8 that had a pretty weak cast from a chef perspective. But on the other hand, I feel like with the field that we're working with, she is obviously one of the better chefs across the season, though not as consistent as the top 2, which is why she's here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and this is another pretty interesting pick here, but we actually have the person that Nona beat at the end, and here we have Russell, the runner-up of the season. And obviously I would have picked Russell to win over Nona, at least in this Final Two, though even then, I can understand why Russell ends up losing by the end of it, considering his attitude. And even if we are looking at his game beforehand, it's definitely not perfect. Now, he does have a good start, having a good signature dish, and he follows it up with pretty good services for the most part. And while he is kicked out of service 2, that was in a spot to where most of his team was getting kicked out anyway. But I really feel like Russell was a pretty dominant force on the blue team, being one of the more consistent leaders for that team. And we see that reflected in Service 5, where he does particularly well and ends up winning best of the best in that service, which is pretty good. And while he does fail to get out his target in Sabrina, that was obviously a non-elim round. And it's not until Service 8 that we see him having a genuinely bad service, where he's obviously pretty domineering in that service, really annoying his team. And obviously he struggles a lot with communication in that service, and he does get kicked out of that service, though he's also the only person on his team to not be nominated, so at least that's a minor pro. But then we get to service 9, which I would say is a genuinely bad service for him as well, where he is once again annoying people like Rob with his leadership. You have him making mistakes, gets kicked out of the service, and he is nominated here due to his leadership specifically, and he handles it pretty terribly, where he ends up confronting Trev and Vinnie after the fact, like being very upset at them for putting him on the block to begin with, which I think is a pretty bad look, though he's able to follow it up with a decent service, ensuring that he gets to the black jacket phase. Though I think he kind of slumps a bit in service 11, having a pretty bad service there, getting kicked out of that service. Service 12, he does recover a bit, where while he does come in last place during the reward challenge, he's able to pick it up during the actual service, like sort of similar to Nona being a leader figure while Ramsey is away from the kitchen. And while he stumbles a bit at the first Final Four service, having a pretty bad service on the fish station and being targeted by Trev and Julian, he's able to survive that nomination. He's able to recover pretty well at this second Final Four service,
not only doing pretty well in the past there, but also undercutting Trev by making him look bad while he's on the pass, ensuring that Trev is taken out at the Final Four. And he gets to a Final Two where on paper he is the better chef. He is someone who has been more dominant across the season, who has been more of an outward leader across the season, and probably should have won this season, though he ends up losing due to his attitude, where he is seen as this pretty unlikable presence and someone that Ramsay didn't want to reward by giving a restaurant to them. So I do feel like you had to fault Russell for really upsetting Ramsay to the point where Ramsay didn't want to give him the win by the end of it. But I do feel like Russell played the better game compared to Nona. I feel like if I were Ramsay, I would give him the win, in my personal opinion. And I feel like he played a more outwardly dominant game compared to Nona. But obviously, I still think he has his missteps. I still think he did things that contributed to him losing by the end of it. And I feel like the number one person is probably a more consistent chef, if I'm being honest, where I feel like that person has a much cleaner game compared to Russell, where even though he was more out in front, he also had some missteps along the way, and obviously has his flaws that lead to his downfall, which is a big reason why he is here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the chef I believe did the best on Hell's Kitchen Season 8 is Julian, the 3rd place finisher on the season, and this may be an unpopular opinion. However, I largely see Julian as a better version of Russell, where even with Russell, while he was pretty out in front for a lot of the season, he also had his flaws, like he had his bad services, had points where he was nominated, and obviously did things that made it so that Ramsay didn't want to give him the win by the end of it. I feel like Julian is someone who was pretty similar to Russell in terms of her consistency during the season, but was also someone who had a better shot of winning by the time of the end game, only for her to not actually make it to the end. Where if we are looking at a run, it is a pretty consistent run for a lot of it, with her being a pretty strong force on the red team early on, having a good signature dish, and not really having a bad service early on. Now, yeah, we do see her making some mistakes here and there, like she forgets to bring the scallops to the chef's table in service 6, she messes up a risotto in service 7, but really for a lot of her run, she's able to keep her head down and not really make any major mistakes, unlike what we saw from the likes of Nona and Russell. She wins at best of the best during service 9, which is pretty good. Service 10 is also pretty good, where she ends up being the second person to get her black jacket, really showing Ramsay's confidence in her during that section of the game. And I feel like compared to the other endgamers, she doesn't really have as big of a drop-off compared to those other people, where her only truly bad service across the entire season is in service 12, which admittedly is pretty bad, where she struggles a lot on the fish station, making tons of mistakes there. But even then, in her worst service, she still is not nominated there, where instead the eyes are more so on Trev and Gail by that point. So even her one bad service isn't even that bad in my eyes. And I feel like she turns it around enough in the 2 Final Four services, where during the first Final Four service, she does pretty well there, making some good dishes. And even in the second Final Four service, while she does fail a quality control test during her turn on the pass, and you also have Trev making some mistakes during her turn that kind of make her look bad, I feel like she did well enough on the pass with her being assertive and really taking charge of the kitchen to where she probably should have made it to the Final 2, especially considering how consistent she had been during the entire season. And even when Ramsay is eliminating her, he still lets her keep her jacket at that point, which I think shows that Ramsay did have a decent amount of respect for her by the time she goes home there. And I feel like considering how consistently she performed during the entire season, I probably would have picked her to go to the Final 2 over Nona and probably beat Russell by the end of it. But I feel like with Ramsay feeling more of a connection towards Nona and seeing her as having more potential to run a restaurant, I feel like that kind of left Julian out to dry by the very end of it. But I feel like based off how consistently she performed across the entire season, while still having pretty high highs along the way, with her winning a best of the best along the way, her never being nominated during the course of the season, and her still having some win equity by the time of the Final Four, I feel like she's probably a better version of Russell, and she's definitely a better version of Nona, even though she does come up short by the end of it, to where I feel like she played the best game on the season, and because of that, she is here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now, I'll probably continue to make these videos as time permits, though there are obviously other shows coming up along the way, particularly Big Brother 26, so you can expect coverage of those shows. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.